little piles everywhere. So we don't really have an update of our news site and what else is going on, but it was just a reminder this morning of how far we've come, and just to remember, how far God has brought us here, and just grateful for all of those that have been involved in every step, all the way back to when the first Promise team was formed, and all of those that were involved in that, all the way up to people who were out here last summer working on work nights, and people who came out to plant the trees. So we're just grateful for everyone who's been involved just over the years. So this morning, we're going to talk a little bit about loving your neighbor. But first, I just wanted to say Happy Mother's Day. Happy Mother's Day to all of those here. For me, I wanted to say Happy Mother's Day to my mom and to my grandma. For me, my mom and my grandmas in my life made a huge spiritual impact. My mom, I can't tell you how much she probably prayed for me and my brother, and how much she wanted us to be in church. And my mom's mom just wanted her whole family to be a part of the church and to know God and to know His love. And my dad's mom, she still sets the example of what it means to actually pray for people. Like, a lot of us will say, hey, let me pray for that. Well, she has this list, and she'll be praying for things, and months later she'll ask you about that. And you might have even forgotten about that, but she's still praying for you. And of commitment, she attends no matter where she's at. She'll always find the time to go to church. And I've seen it with my wife too, with our son and our son that's on the way, just how much she prays over them. So just thankful for all of the moms and the spiritual impact that you make. I do want to recognize this morning that Mother's Day can be a time of sadness. Maybe it's because of a recent loss. Maybe it's because your mom wasn't quite there for you like you've seen in other people. But I do just want to thank all of the women that have been a mentor to somebody. Just because, how many times that you've prayed for somebody who would be lost without you. So thank you to all of the moms here this morning. So this morning, we're going to talk about loving your neighbor. And one thing my mom taught me was how to be a good neighbor. If we think about neighbors, I think there's a few kinds of neighbors that we can all relate to. There's the good neighbor, the one that you actually look forward to seeing, the one who might even snow blow your driveway, your sidewalks, the one that brings you stuff, the one that you enjoy talking to, the one that takes care of their property in a way that doesn't affect your property. Then we all know that some people know the bad neighbor, the one that you try to avoid like the plague, and they don't take care of their property and it affects your property, and they don't tell their kids what to do, and they're always leaving stuff all over the place. But there's also the mysterious neighbor. I think a few of us have had those. You don't really care because they're not around a lot, but you have no idea what they do because you hardly ever see them. But we also have the misunderstood neighbor. One of my favorite movies growing up was The Sandlot. And so there's this fear that is surrounded by the mysterious. But once you get to know a neighbor and you get to know them in their heart, you realize how good they are. This morning we're going to talk about what it means to love your neighbor. And I know for some of you, you're like, what is a neighbor? My in-laws grew up in the country. They built their house on mom's land, and their neighbor was separated by many, many acres of farmland. And then when they moved to town and they had somebody next door, they didn't know what to do. Because they didn't know what it meant to have a neighbor that wasn't mom or grandma. And so for some of you, that's probably you this morning. Those farming neighbors, you don't really ever see them except when you need help with, a tractor or something. So the Bible has a lot to say about neighbors. The Old Testament talks about neighbors all the time, how we're supposed to care for them, and how we're supposed to stand up for them, how we're supposed to handle disputes with our neighbors, and how we're supposed to love them, and the things that we're not supposed to do, not to steal or to covet or to harm our neighbors. And in the New Testament, Jesus kind of expands our idea of what a neighbor is. And that's really what we're going to talk about this morning. So you can see the scripture in your bulletins and on the screen. It's from Luke 10. And it says this, "Teacher, what should I do to inherit eternal life?" And Jesus replied, "What does the law of Moses say? How do you read it?" And the man answered, "You must love the Lord your God with all your heart, all your soul, all your strength, and all your mind, and love your neighbor as yourself." "Right," Jesus told him, "do this and you will live." The man wanted to justify his actions, and so he asked Jesus, who is my neighbor? So we have this religious leader, and he asks Jesus this question, and he gives a great response. He knows exactly what to say. But at the end of it, he says, Jesus, who is my neighbor? You know, was he trying to figure out who exactly he had to actually love? Was he trying to kind of avoid loving some people, or was he really trying to understand more? And Jesus responds by giving the parable of the Good Samaritan. And many of us have heard the Good Samaritan. I know for me, the parable of the Good Samaritan is probably the first story I remember learning in children's church. Little brick Nazarene church on Main Street in Willard, Ohio. And we were in the children's classroom, and we watched this cartoon version of the Good Samaritan. And it's a story I've heard many times. It's a story I've read many times. I've heard many sermons on it. But this past week, a few months ago, I was reading a book, and it was about just kind of expanding our biblical study and how we can look at passages in new ways. And the book is actually called Fresh Eyes. So it's looking at passages from different angles. And the question that it really asked was, let's just look at this word neighbor, and what does it mean? And so really for us this morning, we're going to explore this question, who is my neighbor? And so Jesus tells this parable of the Good Samaritan. And I'm just going to summarize it for us this morning, but I encourage you to read it this week. It's in Luke 10, verses 30 to 37. And so there's a man who is walking along, and he is robbed, and he is left for dead on the side of the road. And a priest walks by, and this man's only hope is that somebody stops and helps him. But a priest walks by and does nothing. And then a temple servant walks by and does nothing. And we aren't told why. You know, some people speculate. Maybe they thought he was dead and they didn't want to be around the dead body because of all of the ceremonial laws there were to enter the temple if you had been around a dead body. We're not really told why they don't stop. But then the Samaritan stops. If you know the story, the Samaritan is the one who helps him. And Samaritans were not liked by the Jewish people at all. There is this deep hatred. There's this deep sense of not liking these people at all. And I think for us, you know, we probably think of sports and the team up north, but this goes so much deeper. It's religious and political, their hatred for one another. But it's the Samaritan who stops and helps him, and he takes care of his wounds, and he takes him to a hotel, and he pays for his care, and he pays for his food, and he even leaves extra money in case this person needs it. And so the point of Jesus' story was to get this Jewish religious leader to understand what the good neighbor was. And he says this at the end of that passage. Jesus asked, which one of these three would you say was a neighbor to the man who was attacked by the bandits? And the man replied, the one who showed him mercy. And then Jesus said, yes, go and do the same. Jesus was pointing out that the good neighbor, the one who was actually loving, was the one that took time and had to sacrifice. The one that went out of their way, even if it inconvenienced them, to take care of another. And so for us this morning, we're going to explore this question of who is my neighbor. And I want to start this morning. We're going to go beyond just what we typically think of our neighbor, but we're going to start there this morning. So our first point, if you're following along in your outlines, is to love your geographical neighbor. Love your neighbor that lives in the same neighborhood, that lives next door, that lives in the same city, the one that you encounter regularly. Love the person that you interact with on a regular basis. And for us this morning, I think, as we spend time here, I want us to explore like new ways and ways for us to rethink what it means to love the people that live close to us. I know for me, my struggle as a neighbor, I have no problem, you know, I'll help my neighbor load things into his truck, or help him unload mulch, or I'll help snow blow multiple people in our neighborhood. I'll help in all of those tangible ways. But for me, I'm introverted, and so, you know, the easy way to understand that is extroverts are energized by people. Some of you know extroverts because you're waiting on them after church because they're talking to people. You're like, come on, we want to go. But they're energized by people. Introverts can kind of feel drained by people, and they're energized when they spend time alone. And for me, sometimes I feel like, you know, throughout the day and working with people, I feel like I struggle then when I get home because I just want to spend that time to re-energize. But for me, the way that I'm challenging myself is finding new ways to interact with neighbors and finding ways to intentionally be able to talk with them. You know, in today's world, we pull into our neighborhood, we open our garage door, and then we close it behind us, and then we don't see anybody. But how are ways that we can find new ways to interact? Maybe for you, one day, the way that you loved your neighbor was to help them with the physical task. It was to help them lift things. It was to help them when they needed something like mowing or snow blowing. But you're unable to do that anymore. So what are ways that you can think of how you can love your neighbor now? I know for me growing up, we had neighbors, and when they made tamales, they always brought some over. And I love that. Maybe for you, if you have a garden and you have all of this extra, you want to be able to take it and to bless somebody. So a way that you can love your neighbor is to give what you can give. And maybe that's just conversation, because I think we all have people in our neighborhood who don't have a lot of family around and who just want to spend time talking to somebody. So what are ways that you can love your neighbor? What are ways that you can love the people that you interact with on a regular basis? And maybe that means stepping out of your comfort zone. I know that I have to do that to be able to love my neighbor in a better way. And so as we explore this question this morning, Jesus, who is my neighbor? We're going to look a little bit more, and our second point is to love your online neighbor. So in 2019, it feels like everything is online. And as a youth pastor, I'm in this weird dichotomy of the people that I work with, the kids, they think I'm old, they think I'm ancient, and their parents think I'm a baby. And when I was in high school, Facebook wasn't even out yet. My senior year is when it came out, and so MySpace was still a thing, and we didn't really have a whole lot of online interactions. You know, when we played Xbox, if you wanted to play with somebody, you were playing with a sibling or somebody down the street. And now they're playing with people all over the world. And so everything is online. And so I think for us to explore this idea of who's my neighbor, we have to include our online neighbor. Because it's so easy to say something behind a screen that we would never say to somebody face to face. So how can we find new ways to love our online neighbors? You know, social media is a wonderful thing. You know, we have Facebook, and you can connect with family, you can see pictures, and you can connect with classmates that you would have no other way of really interacting with. And as a church, social media is wonderful because we can encourage and we can foster community, and we can share scripture, and we can pray for one another. But I think, you know, we often just see the bad of social media. You know, Twitter has this reputation of just being completely negative. People just say what they want to say, and everybody has a thought, and everybody has differing opinions, and they feel like they need to share it. And so there's this terrible side to social media where people just tear each other down, and they don't love each other at all. But for us this morning, I think that we need, if we're going to talk about loving our neighbor, we need to include our online neighbor. If you think about Jesus' response, he was saying, you know, you have to have some self-sacrifice. You have to love people even if you don't agree with them. The way that he responded to that religious leader's question would have just completely shattered their expectations. He was saying, you also have to love Samaritans. That the Samaritan was the one that was actually loving his neighbor when your religious leaders were not. You know, we have to love people we don't agree with. So politically, I feel like everybody online is sharing their political opinion, right? So I'm going to get eye rolls, and I'm going to get people who are like, are you serious? We have to love our neighbor. So Republicans, you have to love Democrats even when you don't agree with them. And Democrats, you have to love Republicans even when you don't agree with them. And Libertarians, you have to love both of them. And that means that when we respond, we have to actually think that our response can be loving our neighbor or not loving our neighbor. You know, we often feel like, they're so short-sighted, I have to set them straight. These people need to know what I think about this. But who's our neighbor? Our neighbor includes those that we interact with online. And so, you know, debate online can be so polarizing. But I saw this example, it was over this topic that is very polarizing and people have very differing views. But I saw a conversation and it was loving and it was respectful and they didn't agree at all. but you could tell that they respected each other. They respected each other's opinions even though they didn't agree with it. And unfortunately, that's the exception and not the norm. You know, we often feel like we have to be able to get our point across, but we don't understand how that can maybe come across as not loving. And I'm not saying that you have to change your views or change somebody else's views, but I'm saying that we have to love our online neighbor. So I have a few things in your bulletins, and you can see it says think before you post or respond. And I would even add to that, pray before you post or respond. Especially over these polarizing issues and these political topics, pray. Think about it before you post it. You know, oftentimes when we get into these polarizing topics and these debates, we often are comfortable sitting behind the screen to do it. But if you can, seek a face-to-face conversation, invite that person out to coffee. Because it's very hard to read body language when you're just reading words, right? Like, people might be respectful in how they respond, but you might not be able to see that. You might just see words. So if you can, spend time face-to-face with people. And be open to other people's views. You don't have to change your views, but you have to understand that the way that we interact online can love or not love our neighbor. And I understand that it's a challenge, but that's what Jesus' parable was all about. He was saying to love your neighbor, you have to have some self-sacrifice. You have to think about others. It might even inconvenience you, but to love your neighbors as you love yourself. Think about that. Like, how would I feel if somebody responded this way? And if we do that, I think that we can go a long way in loving our online neighbors. And our third point this morning, which we're going to spend most of our time, is to love your future neighbor. And I'm going to explain what I mean by that. And I think, you know, as we think about ways we can love our neighbor, this one we don't often think about. But if you think about the ways that we act and how it can impact people that come after us. So think about if you're going to Wendy's and you're at a table, and if you were to leave your table full of trash and mess, and then it's busy and some family comes in with 3 kids later and there's nowhere to sit and all that's left is the table that you left dirty. That would be not loving your future neighbor. Because I think, you know, I don't think any of us would take our tray of trash and just dump it on somebody's table that's actually there. But oftentimes people will inconvenience others without really thinking about how that's not loving their future neighbor. Or I know a lot of people in here, you know, anybody that's bought a home or done any remodeling to a home, you can see people who cut corners because they know that they're going to move out soon. People who hide things because they know they're going to move out soon. And they just leave it for the person that's going to come in the future. I know for my dad, he was remodeling a house, and when they were looking at it, they looked at the electrical panel and everything looked brand new and updated. But after they bought it and they got into it, they realized it was just there to make it look good. There was tons of electrical issues underneath once they started tearing things down. And so when we don't think about how we're going to impact those that come after us, we're not loving our future neighbor. The decisions that we make now can love or not love those who come after us. And I understand that that isn't normal. It goes beyond our world's typical expectations, but that's what loving your neighbor is. That's what Jesus was trying to do. He was trying to expand our understanding of who our neighbor is, even if we don't even have the opportunity to interact with them. I want to spend some time in Deuteronomy 15, and I think this will speak a little bit to this topic. It's in verse 7, it says, "If there are any poor Israelites in your towns when you arrive in the land the Lord your God is giving you, do not be hard-hearted or tight-fisted toward them. Instead, be generous and lend them whatever they need. Do not be mean-spirited and refuse someone a loan because the year of canceling debts is close at hand. If you refuse to make a loan and the needy person cries out to the Lord, you will be considered guilty of sin. Give generously to the poor and not grudgingly, for the Lord your God will bless you in everything you do. There will always be some in the land who are poor. That's why I'm commanding you to share freely with the poor and with other Israelites in need." So they had this way of living in where they had a year of cancellation of debt. And this year was designed to break the cycles of poverty. It was designed to foster this community where people cared for one another, where people cared even out of their own pockets for one another. And so people were not giving loans because they knew, hey, soon it's going to be the year of canceling debts and I'm not going to get that money back. And so we see in this passage that their attitudes, their hearts were condemned, because this was created not to be just done begrudgingly, not to just do it because they had to do it. It was created so they could foster this community where the ethos of their community, their heart, their soul of their community was supposed to be love and generosity. They were supposed to take care of one another, even if it meant it cost them financially. And so for us this morning, I think if we can make generosity and love like the essence of our community as a church, the essence of our community as we interact with others, it can speak volumes to those around us. They weren't loving their neighbor that was to come in the future because they were refusing to give them loans. They had these future implications. But Jesus calls us to live generously and to live self-sacrificially. You know, if we think back to owning a home or redoing a home, you know, we can ask that question, you know, who is my neighbor? Because if we think about this passage and it said, if you don't give a loan, you will be considered guilty of sin. He was saying, you know, your attitude and your approach to this is making you guilty of sin. If we apply that to how we live and the decisions that we make now, understanding that those decisions can impact people in the future, to understand that, you know, if we cut a corner here to put it on somebody else, that can be considered sin. You know, we ask this question, who is my neighbor? We have to think about who we're going to impact in the future. And I think that really speaks to us as a church now. You know, I was reading a book and it was talking about this idea a little bit. And he talked about how he was a president of a Christian boarding school. And how in the 1930s they built a building. When they were building a building, they built the septic tank. And it was cinder block. And they didn't have a ton of money. And so they were trying to cut some corners, tried to save some money. So they used one of those walls of that septic tank as a foundation wall for the home. And it worked for like 60 years, but then 60 years down the road, it left these future people with this problem because everything started to sink in and the foundation started to crumble. And so where they thought they were saving money, they were actually costing more money in the future. And I think us as a church, you know, we're in this spot where we're stepping out of an old site and stepping into a new one, and the decisions we can make now can impact the future generations of this church. And I'm not talking necessarily about, you know, the color, the paint, or the carpet, or any of those things, because I think, you know, 20 years changes those so drastically. I mean, if you look at our parlor, you know, one day, wood paneling was all the rage, right? And now we have wood paneling, and I'm sorry if you're the one that put that in. But now people don't like wood paneling. And so those things, that's not what I'm talking about, because we can't really control how the trends are going to go. What I am talking about, the materials we choose and the foundations we build physically and the foundations we build spiritually. The decisions we make now can impact the future generations. We have to tread with caution, but also with faith. We have to make decisions that don't leave the future generations of this church with crippling debt. But we also want to make decisions where we choose the right material so it lasts. You know, the decisions we make now can love or not love our future generations of this church. You know, I think it's even more important, though, for our spiritual foundations. Because if we look at our old building, we look at the people who took steps of faith to build the first sanctuary. You know, they were living in a way that was self-sacrificial, it inconvenienced them, but they were loving the future generations of that church. It benefited them at that time, but, you know, 150 years of people getting to enjoy that beautiful sanctuary. And then the people that decided to add on to that, and then the people that added the classroom wings. You know, some of you are sitting in here this morning, you had to make sacrifices to be able to make that happen. And you loved the future generations of that church because you did that. And we have that same opportunity now as we're moving into a new church. We have the opportunity to do that again. We never know what decisions we make now, how that can impact a building that could sit there, or we don't even know what's going to sit on this side of the property. You know, the decisions of the steps of faith that we take, the way that we follow the guiding of the Spirit are going to impact the future generations, and we can love our future neighbor. So if we ask that question, Lord, who is my neighbor? You know, we can think about the future. We might not ever interact with them, but the decisions we make now can love them. You know, if we think about our neighbor and who that can be, and we think about how we can love people that live in our neighborhood and new ways to do that, especially in today's world, like what are ways we can be creative to actually spend time with our neighbors? What are ways that we can love the people that we see, or the people that we don't even see? You know, it's not a new thing, but when you're in the drive-through line and you kind of get that nudge to pay for somebody behind you, like how much of an impact does that make for people? Or you know, when you go out of your way to help a neighbor to do something, even if they don't see it, like how much does that impact them? Or even online, I know that can be a challenging one, but Jesus was challenging his audience and challenging us to understand who our neighbor is, to understand that the way that we interact with people face to face or behind a screen, can love them or not love them. You know, we now as a church have this opportunity to love the future generations. You know, imagine if this was lived out. Imagine if we made generosity and love the core of who we are. Imagine for the kids that are sitting in that nursery right now, and it might even be for their grandkids, of the decisions that we make now. You know, people looking back 20, 30, 40 years from now and looking at the pond and looking at the trees and looking at the beach and wondering, you know, thanking the people who decided to take steps of faith. I know it's going to require sacrifice. I mean, so many people have already sacrificed so much to bring us to where we are now. And I know it's going to take steps of faith, but I believe that God is calling us to do that. We've seen that in so many ways. You know, one day people might look at that beach and they might say, you know, thank goodness those people took those steps of faith because so many people have been baptized in that pond. Or the steps of faith to build a building here, the steps of faith to envision what could be out there, you know. It's not an easy thing to leave a church that's been there for 150 years, that's comfortable, that provides heat, that provides room, that provides classrooms. It's not an easy decision, but I believe that God is bringing us to this place. So it requires steps of faith. It requires loving our neighbor, even if we don't really get a chance to interact with them. So we have this opportunity. We have this opportunity as a church to do this. We have this opportunity to live this out. We have this opportunity to love and sacrifice so it can impact generations to come. You know, I'm so grateful for all of the people that have made those decisions for 385. So grateful for all of the people that have received communion, that have taken steps of faith, that received Jesus for the first time in that building, that have been baptized in that building. And now we have that opportunity to love our neighbor. Now we have that opportunity, as we saw in this scripture, to make sacrifices in a way that impacts those that are to come. So this morning I ask us if we can ask that question, Jesus, who is my neighbor? You know, imagine if we live that out and we go day by day asking that. It might be the people that we see in the grocery store. It might be the people that don't live next to us, but that we interact with regularly because we're at Tim Hortons every Saturday. And we have the same waitress at Bob Evans every time we go there. You know, the ways that we can rethink this can help us understand who our neighbor is. So this morning, our challenge, and it's a challenge for me, is for us to ask that question. You know, how can I be a better neighbor? How can I love my neighbor in a better way? And it might require you to think differently. It might require you to be more creative. It might require you to, you know, it might inconvenience you in your time. But I think if we can live this out, I think it can really make an impact. You know, when you post online and respond, you know, people are reading those comments, and I don't know how many times you've read a comment and you're like, man, what's wrong with that person? Or like, what got under their skin today? But imagine if you responded, even if you didn't agree in a loving and a kind way, imagine the impact that could make. Or imagine if you were taking care of your neighbor even when they didn't ask you, you're providing, you know they're gone, so you make sure that you offer to take their trash to the curb while they're gone. Imagine the impacts that we could make if we as a church lived in a way and we shared the stories about this church. We shared the stories about 385, and we shared the stories about how much God is already moving here. Imagine the impact that we could make if we all live this out. If we all say, I want to love my neighbor as myself. I think we could make a huge impact. And I'm excited for what it could mean for the people that are out there. You know, I'm excited for all of these little ones that, are going to be graduating in 15 to 18 years, and what the steps that we're taking now. Imagine the church that's going to be sitting there for them. Imagine, next week's graduation Sunday, and we're going to, celebrate our graduates, and they're going to be standing here. But what about those kids that are there? Where are they going to be standing in? What steps of faith will we have taken to make an impact in their lives? And I think that would encourage them to live it out, to live out their faith, and to live out their love. So let me pray for us this morning. God, we come to you this morning, and we ask you this question: who is my neighbor? Not in a way to get out of loving people that we don't want to love, but God, in a way that we want you to expand our understanding. We want you to show us new ways to love our neighbors. We want you to show us who our neighbor is, whether that's online or people we might not even interact with, people that the decisions we make that make an impact in the future. But God, I know there's other ways, there's other neighbors that we aren't even considering. There's ways that we can love our neighbor that's across the world. There's ways that we can love neighbors that we don't even understand yet. So God, I pray that you would challenge us. It's not easy. But God, if we can take these steps of faith, if we can live in a way that is self-sacrificial, if we can live in a way that you've showed us to live, if we can love our neighbor as ourselves, God, I think that we can really share your love with the world and make an impact. So God, I pray for us as a church. I pray that as we take these steps of faith, that we would take them in line with you and with the guidance of the Spirit. God, it's easy to have the timeline set in our minds. It's easy to have the ideas of how we want it to go. But God, you are in this, and we want to follow you and you alone. We don't want it to be about us. We don't want it to be about what we want. We want it to be about what you want and the impact that we can make. God, I pray that you would help us figure out ways to take these steps of faith as we come out onto this new land. God, we pray for the sale of the church. We pray for all of the zoning readings and all of the things that have to happen. God, we pray that you would help us to, as we take these journeys, we take these next steps of having to have a capital campaign, I pray that you would challenge us and help us figure out ways to raise the money. Help us to build strong foundations, both physically and spiritually, for this church. God, I pray that you would help us to make the right decisions, to make the wise decisions. Help us to not cripple the future generations with debt, but help us make the right decisions of what materials we choose and the way that we go about it. And God, we have so much unknown on this land. We don't even know really what's to come on this back half of this property. And that can seem so far down the line, but God, I pray that you would help lead us there, that you would help us figure out ways that we can use this land to make an impact in this community, to be able to share your love with others. I pray this in your name.